Okay, so for this class, we're going to go over the foundations of the American government by looking at the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers. However, before we get into that, I thought we'd take a slight detour and try to talk a little bit more about how a capitalist system operates. I would argue that understanding capitalism is as important as any of these documents for understanding the American government, perhaps more so. As we've talked about in previous classes, the so-called social relations of production in large part determine the political structure of a society, the political institutions of a society, and the American government is no exception to that. So I think sort of understanding the underlying economic structure of the society is important to understand how these political institutions have taken shape. So to do that, of course, we will briefly try to summarize the uh, understanding of capitalism offered by Karl Marx, whose understanding of the capitalist, what he called mode of production, is still unsurpassed, I would say. Far superior to any earlier theorists who have attempted to understand it. And really, still to this day, I would say unmatched by anyone who has sort of followed in his wake. He provides the most sort of systematic account of how a capitalist system operates. And even though Marx, lived after the American Revolution, his theory can be sort of read back into it and help us to understand how capitalism relates to the American system of government. Now, of course, there are a lot of people that, like I've said, have followed along in Marx's wake. Uh, One book that I would recommend as a sort of good introduction to Marxist theory is this book here, Zombie Capitalism by Chris Harman. I've actually added this to the reading list if you want to look at it. Of course, Marx's writings themselves are important to consult and read. Many of them are dense and complicated. The logical starting point for most people is the Communist Manifesto, quote written by Marx and Engels. I could actually make up a list of some good introductory readings for Marx if anyone's interested in that. Um, what I'll mostly try to do is try to summarize Marx's, magnum opus, uh, Capital, which is 3 volumes. Only the first volume was actually published in Marx's lifetime. Volumes 2 and 3 were published out of manuscripts written by Marx, but not finalized for publication. Were sort of edited by Engels and published by him. Now, keep in mind, of course, that Capital, the 3 volumes of Capital are a massive work, thousands of pages long. So all I can do is try to briefly give a sort of brief overview of them. Mostly focusing on Capital Volume 1, but I'll try to bring in the other important parts of it, particularly Volume 3 dealing with the theory of crisis as well. Now, the reason why Marx spends so much time talking about capitalism, of course, is he wants people to understand how the system works, and I think from there sort of build a realization of the necessity for socialism. Now, Marx himself wrote relatively little about socialism during his lifetime, which is funny enough because most people, when they criticize Marx, they criticize the idea of of socialism and how it's supposed to work and things like that. But Marx really spent very little time talking about that. Most of his writing concerns with again what he refers to as the laws of motion of a capitalist system. An account of which I think is, like I said, still basically unsurpassed to this very day. Um, and I think, all right, well, just sort of getting right into it, how do you really sort of characterize what a capitalist system is? So, you know, the definitions can be tricky, and again, this is a very sort of condensed version of it, but I'll try to at least focus on I think what are some of the more essential characteristics of it. So one, you could say it is characterized by the alienation of workers. In that sense, it means that workers lack control over the means of production, factories, machinery, land, and the products of their labor, the things that they actually produce by their labor. They don't own these things. They don't control these things in any way. There is this sort of essential separation of workers from these things. Now, this is a historical phenomenon as well. One of the things that separates Marx from earlier theorists of capitalism, most notably Adam Smith and David Ricardo, is that Marx understood better that capitalism is a historical phenomenon that comes into being at a certain point in time in history. Other theorists prior to him tended to talk about capitalism, they just sort of take it for granted for the most part. They talk about capital and labor and profits and things like that, but they talk about these economic categories as if they are just sort of always there and don't really sort of question or inquire into the origins of these things, where these things actually um, come from. Now, Marx's work itself, or Marx is commonly understood to be an economist or an economic thinker, and that's really not true, or maybe at best only partially true. I think it's probably best to understand Marx first and foremost as a philosopher, and he's sort of giving you a philosophical critique of what was then referred to as political economy. Again, basically the writings of Smith and Ricardo and other sort of lesser figures as well. And it's sort of, a logical analysis of their theories, of their understanding of things, and sort of, trying to demonstrate where these things fall short. Basically, if you take their theory, Smith and Ricardo, for how a capitalist system is supposed to operate, Marx is trying to demonstrate that, even under these somewhat ideal conditions of how capitalism works, you would still basically run into all of these problems. And one of the major problems from the very outset is, again, workers are basically separated from the things that they use to produce things and the things that they produce themselves. And that was not always the case, of course. Up until a certain point in history, starting roughly around, most people date the origins of capitalism to around, 15th century or so, depending upon how you define it. Prior to that, production was something that workers controlled themselves. If you were a craftsman, if you were, involved in some kind of small time manufacturing, you generally owned the tools in which you used to produce things, and the things that you produce, you owned, and you sold them, and you kept the proceeds of the sale from themselves. At a certain point in history, there began to become this separation of workers from these things. They did not own these things. The common ownership of land and things like that was privatized in England and in other places. And workers were people who used to work the land were more or less cast off from the land and sort of forced to go into the cities, where they became this sort of growing urban working class, which became basically the foundations of the proletariat. Right. Anyway, so that's one of the first characteristics. Workers are separated from the means of production. Interestingly enough, while we normally assume this to be a system of private ownership where basically somebody else owns the means of production, the capitalist class, in other words, you could imagine this in a so-called state capitalist system as well, in the Soviet Union or in China, for example. Workers are still, you know, not in control of the means of production there, right? They're more or less now not under necessarily the dictates of private capitalists, although in many cases in China they are, but in many cases under the sway of the dictates of the party bureaucracy there. So you have a similar system of separation of workers in a private capitalist system or in a state capitalist system. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And so, like I said, one of the essential characteristics of determining what a capitalist system is. Are the workers actually separated from the means of production? Then that means basically that you're dealing with a capitalist system. Now, from this separation of workers from the means of production, you have the institution of wage labor developing. So the relationship between workers and the means of production and what they produce is basically, mediated by the idea of a wage. So since they don't actually own these things themselves, and since they are basically working for somebody else, they are basically paid a wage in exchange for their labor, or what Marx calls their labor power, basically. So wage labor, alienation of workers, these are again essential characteristics. And again, these are things that you would also find in many state capitalist systems as well. Workers in the Soviet Union were paid wages. Money was used as a means of exchange and transaction. So those are, again, sort of core elements of a capitalist system. Then production in a capitalist system is geared towards the idea of commodity production as well. So goods and services are produced primarily for exchange, market sale, rather than for direct use. So people are producing things, but they are producing things to be sold in the market, basically in order to make a profit rather than for their own direct use. So, in a sense, what that means is that capitalist production, or what is actually being produced in a capitalist system, the actual use or utility of these things is completely secondary to their so-called exchange value. How much profit you can basically make through selling these things in the market. And in essence, the capitalists themselves care very little for what the actual physical, tangible properties of these goods are. All they really care about is the sort of exchange value that's sort of embodied in these things. So again, production for exchange rather than production for use. Now you can see all sorts of examples of how this idea runs people into various problems. First of all, you talk about the sort of increasing commodification of different aspects of life. So in modern day society, you talk about the commodification of healthcare, the commodification of education, housing, various other things like that. You also talk about when you realize that exchange value more than use value is the predominant characteristic. I think it also helps explain things like, for example, the continued production of fossil fuels. Everybody knows now, or most people know, I think, that oil and gas and coal and things like that are extremely hazardous. And whatever they do have a use, obviously, as a source of um, energy, but their use brings significant environmental consequences to it. So the use value of these things is very much a double-edged sword. There again significant negative characteristics associated with these things. However, since they continue to be insanely profitable industries for the most part, they continue to be produced. So I would think that would be one application of this idea to understanding contemporary conflicts like climate change right now. Why are we so unable to get ourselves off of fossil fuels? Because in a capitalist system, what matters most is production for exchange rather than production for use. In other words, producing things that are socially useful and beneficial to people. And then finally, and again, this is a very sort of condensed version. You have the accumulation of capital. So capital is not a static system; it is an expansive and dynamic system. It expands outwards and expands in intensity as well. So the surplus value, or the profits generated by the workers, is appropriated by capitalists. So again, since the workers do not own the means of production, what they produce and the value in what they produce is not kept by themselves, of course, but appropriated by the capitalist. The profits that the capitalist accumulates through this is at least part of it used to expand production further in order to again for maximize profits even even more. So capitalism is an expansive system. It grows outward. It, on the one hand, as I've already said, sort of incorporates more and more aspects of life into it. More and more um, aspects of society become commodified. It also expands, in a global and geographical way as well. It expands to other countries and encompasses more and more of the world, to the extent that the creation of a sort of global market, a world market, is you could also add that basically as another sort of essential characteristic of capitalism as well. You can't understand capitalism in just one country. In other words, you have to understand capitalism as a global system, basically. Okay, so again, so the purpose of capitalism is to produce exchange value. So what is that? Basically, it is the ratio or the relation by which commodities are exchanged, typically in money, reflecting the underlying labor value. So what Marx wanted to understand, and what people before him wanted to understand too, is what is the relationship that governs the exchange of different commodities. Why is a coat, to use the example that he uses, valued more than a yard of linen, or something like that? Why is a raw material usually less valuable than the actual finished product? And why is that pretty much always the case? In other words, the prices of these things can vary, but the underlying relationship between these things is always going to be the same for the most part. So the price of a coat can change; it can increase or decrease, but for the most part, the price of a yard of linen will also decrease or increase. If not by the exact same amount, the relationship between the two will more or less be the same. The coat will always be valued more than the material used to produce the coat. And you can use that example for or you can expand that further to use other examples as well. So Marx, and again other thinkers before him, believed that the ratio of value between these things was not an arbitrary thing. It was not something that was just made up, but it was sort of governed by a real sort of objective process. And again, Marx did not invent this idea. What he shared, though, what he eventually came to realize and sort of picked up this idea, is that the value of the commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce them under average conditions of production. In other words, the amount of time it takes to produce something will determine the value of that uh, commodity. So something that takes more time to produce will have a higher value than something that takes less time to produce under average circumstances. So basically, you sort of look at a socially average time it would take to produce a coat, and that basically determines the value of that coat. Now, some people might take longer to manufacture something. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can claim a higher price for it. If anything, they will sort of lose out because it will cost them more, but they'll basically still have to sell it for the same price for the most part. Now, again, obviously, understanding the relation between value and price is a very difficult thing in Marxist theory to understand. They are not always equivalent. In fact, rarely are they equivalent. In fact, but it is one of the most important concepts that you would have to understand. So, to give an example of how this idea of socially necessary labor time plays out, imagine a factory produces goods worth $2,400 in 40 hours. The value created per hour, 2,400 divided by 40 is $60 per hour. Now, what else happens as the exchange of commodities becomes more and more, you know, um, pronounced and expansive? It then requires a commodity that you can use to sort of facilitate this process of exchange, and that's basically where you get money from. So you can imagine exchange value basically in a kind of barter system where we exchange, uh, one set of objects for another set of objects that have an equal amount of labor time embodied in them. But that obviously becomes a very cumbersome process in a very short period of time. So what we then use instead is another commodity, money. In Marx's time, is usually gold or silver. Occasionally, now we basically use paper money, which basically reflects the socially necessary labor time in those things. So we measure the amount of socially necessary labor time in a commodity by the monetary value of that uh, commodity. And again, explaining exactly how this process works is a little bit complicated. I can only give sort of a brief overview of it. I mentioned Harman's book. I would, especially recommend reading maybe the first three chapters of that book. He gives you a pretty good overview of this. Um, and like I said, I can basically make up a list of other readings by Marx if you're interested in learning more about this. Now, of course, critically, there's the exploitation of workers in a capitalist system as well. So workers create value through their labor. Labor is the commodity basically which creates new value, or actually labor power, as he calls it. What Marx argues critically is that the value that workers produce through their labor exceeds what they get back in their wages. So workers receive a wage in exchange for their labor power, but the value in which they produce through their labor is greater than their wage. So essentially, what is happening is that there is a portion of the workday where the worker is basically not being paid for their labor. So there's a portion of the workday where they're performing what is called surplus labor. This surplus labor then becomes surplus value, which is basically the basis of where you get profits from in a capitalist economy. And of course, the capitalist gets to keep that surplus value for themselves, although they themselves then have to sort of distribute it out to other people, bankers and landlords and things like that. Some of it they keep for their own consumption, and some of it they again reinvest it into production to expand capitalism even more. But this idea again of the exploitation of labors is absolutely critical, of course. So again, let me give a few other examples, or try to elaborate a little bit more on this idea of exchange value. So imagine 20 yards of linen equals one coat. Um, Again, the value of the 20 yards of linen is equal to one coat, and that reflects the amount of labor time that is spent producing each. More labor time goes into producing a coat than goes into producing 20 yards of linen. That's why a coat commands a greater exchange value than 20 yards of linen. To take a more modern day example, I'm not going to read all this out here now, but you can see it, and of course the PowerPoint is available. Think of a computer, for example. This is an example that Harman uses in his book. The use value of a computer basically stays the same. What you can do with a computer, what you use a computer for, basically stays the same. But the exchange value of the computer has decreased, meaning that what happens is that, of course, over time, as a capitalist system develops more, productivity develops more, and that reduces the amount of labor time necessary to produce these commodities, which means, of course, that you can then lower that it has a lower value, and then usually a lower price. So it used to take a lot longer, basically, to produce a computer than it does now. Now, because we have reduced the process by which the time in which it takes to produce a computer can be sold much more cheaply than it was prior. I mean, this generally tends to be a tendency that you see playing out in capitalism. Things when they're first introduced usually take a long time to produce, so they have a higher value. As time goes on, we figure out ways to produce these things more effectively, meaning reducing the amount of time it takes to produce these things, and so that generally lowers the value and lowers the price of these things. So what is capital? The term capitalism is again sort of a shorthand term, not really a term that Marx used himself. He talks much more about capital than he talks about capitalism. He would refer to things like the capitalist mode of production, like I already said, which is kind of what people mean when they say capitalism. But capital is not a thing, right? Capital is a product of a social relationship that exists between people. Basically between employer and employee, or between the capitalist and the working class. So capital is a social relation of production that involves control over labor and its products. What Marx is being said here, and again, because I'm trying to be very concise, I'm not using many quotes, if any, from Marx. mostly just trying to paraphrase things that he said. That's pretty close to what he defines capital as. Again, basically, what he's saying is that capital can only emerge in a very specific kind of social circumstance. It's not just an inanimate object that we take for granted or that has always existed in some form or another. Most of the time when people talk about capital, they're basically talking about money, basically, right? Money that's being used to invest in production. But Marx is saying, well, that just doesn't come out of thin air, which obviously everybody knows. But again, he's saying that the creation of capital can only take place under a very specific set of social circumstances, and the social circumstances is basically what I've already outlined prior to this: the alienation of labor, wage labor, production for the market, and things like that. Again, capital would not be possible without the social relationships between employer and employee. Now, what happens though is that there develops a tendency for people to forget this, or that the actual social relationships between employer and employee are concealed behind the operations of the capitalist production process and exchange of commodities in the market. This process is referred to by Marx as the fetishism of commodity, something which I've already talked about in a previous class. Now, the word fetishism, we can thank Sigmund Freud for this, has a different kind of connotation than what Marx means. He's not talking about it in a sexual way or anything like that. If anything, he means it more as like a sort of object of religious worship. And just as people tend to sort of project into religion and objects of worship and veneration in religion, people tend to and sort of forget that these are actual products produced by people. Marx argues that a similar thing happens in the operations of the capitalist system. That people, it becomes very easy, in other words, to forget or to have concealed the social relationships of production that exists between the employer and employee. And what you think then is that capitalism becomes a sort of automatic process. The people forget that it is a relationship between people and instead takes on what he calls a relationship between things, between commodities, in other words. So people often talk about, again, the power of money, that money talks and things like that. Forgetting of course, in fact, that money is basically just pieces of paper and would have no power at all other than the power that we attribute to it, and wouldn't even exist without basically people not just producing the actual paper money, but producing, again, commodities which allow for the accumulation of money. Basically, people talk about the needs of the market, what is necessary to sort of keep the market economic system going, completely forgetting the fact that it is basically people that keep the market going. And again, these social relationships that exist between the employer and the employee. In the previous class, I mentioned that I think COVID was a very powerful demonstration of this kind of fetishism of commodities, which unfortunately seems like most people on the left completely drop the ball on, to take advantage of this as an opportunity to sort of illustrate this, that we very quickly sort of abandon really any real notion of public health, of any real attempt to sort of contain the spread of this virus, to suppress the virus as much as we were capable of, because we had to get the economy going again. And by getting the economy going again does not, again, just mean this automatic process, but means basically getting people back to work again, putting people back into crowded workplaces, even though it was dangerous for them, because that was what what is necessary for the production of commodities. And for all the talk about vaccines and masking, I'm surprised that nobody really fought more about this idea to drive everyone back to work. Everyone feels like, or not everyone, but a lot of people feel that the vaccine mandates was a violation of their freedom and things like that. And there may be an argument for that, or I don't know if I necessarily agree with it, but I could see why people would think that way, at least. but nobody thinks that it's a violation of their freedom to be, forced to go back to work. I don't, many examples of people who were working remotely, then suddenly and usually very abruptly told that they had to return to the office or to the workplace that they're at, and they didn't want to, but they were basically forced to do it anyway. So I think that's actually a very key illustration of how this fetishism of commodities plays out. But unfortunately, I don't see many examples of people, sort of applying this concept to illustrate this. Anyway, I don't want to get too, off track talking about that. But a big part of what Marx is intending here is again to get people to sort of see through this fetishism, to see through the illusion of relationships between things and realize that again that this whole system is basically powered by relationships between people and a very again exploitative relationship between people as well. But the fetishism, this sort of concealment of reality, I think also relates to the idea of false consciousness. And in a previous class, I mentioned how in the concept of ideology that many people object to the idea of equating ideology with false consciousness because it is not a term that Marx actually used himself. Instead, for Marx, ideology basically refers to ideas that serve the interest of the dominant class. I argued that, well, that, even if he doesn't explicitly use the term false consciousness, that kind of at least implies the idea of false consciousness because to suit the needs of the ruling class, obviously some kind of subterfuge or deception is going to be necessary in most most cases. I would also argue that this plays a role in the idea of the fetishism of commodities as well. Fetishism of commodities, I think, more clearly expresses this idea of a kind of false consciousness, right? Here, and again, Marx does not use the term explicitly, but here again, it's heavily implied that Marx is talking about is that the way in which the capitalist system operates is that as a sort of a necessary consequence of how it operates, it conceals from people the true nature of how it actually operates. That again, you sort of lose sight of the social relationships that actually ground the capitalist system, and instead come to see these things as a relationship between things, between money, between uh, commodities, and things like that. You could also argue that economics, since it's one of the main examples of ideology, also assists in this process as well, right? Especially mainstream economics helps in sort of concealing the true dynamics of how a capitalist system operates. So, in large part, what Marx is trying to get people to do is to basically sort of see through this fetishism that exists, to sort of see through the ideological blinders which conceal from people how a capitalist system actually operates. So again, if you want to understand really quickly, or again in a very sort of concise way, how the process of production and circulation works. Production basically refers to how commodities are produced. Obviously, circulation then refers to how these things are sort of put on the market and then sold, and how the proceeds from that sales are then used to fuel further um, production. A sort of again, very simplified model of how this works is seen below here. MCM prime, money, commodity, more money, basically. So capitalists invest money to purchase commodities, which include both the means of production and late labor power. So from the point of view of the capitalist, the labor is just another commodity which they're purchasing basically in order to make things, through the sale of which they hope to obtain a profit, obviously. So that's important to keep in mind. So commodities include both the laborer or their labor power, their ability to work, and the means of production itself, the machinery, the tools, the materials, and things like that. Workers use these commodities to produce new goods or services. The final products are sold for more money, basically generating profit. Now, this is again a simplified way in which it works, but that is basically the idea. But however, then you have to get into more how the dynamics of how this production takes place, especially how this idea of surplus value is created. So again, if you take it MCM prime, it almost seems like this kind of like magical process, right? You start off with a certain amount of money, you invest it in the production process, and at the end of it, at the end of the production and the circulation process, basically you end up with more money than what you started. But how is that more money actually created? Marx is quite clear that the means of production itself cannot create new value. They simply transfer their value on to the commodities which are used to produce them. So, in other words, whatever the value of those means of production are, it simply gets transferred into the final product, which is produced. So the way in which profits are produced is basically through exploiting labor, which means basically forcing the workers to produce more value than what they were actually paid for in their wage. Now, how is this accomplished? Well, Marx argues that the worker is not paid the full value of um, what they produce, but they're paid basically what it costs to maintain the worker. How much does the worker need to sustain themselves in terms of food and shelter and things like that? And it's not always at a subsistence level. There is a so-called historical and moral element to it. In other words, what is sort of seen as sort of an appropriate standard of living for the society will also determine what the worker gets paid. But basically, again, the wage basically refers to what a worker needs to sustain themselves at basically a sort of socially determined level of existence. And that's really not that hard to figure out, actually. You can basically figure out, what the cost of food is in a certain period of time, how much does, housing cost and things like that. And you just sort of break it down month by month, week by week, day by day, hour by hour. So you can kind of, calculate how that works. So that again kind of conceals what is actually going on. The worker receives a wage thinking that this wage is a fair exchange for the value of their labor, but what they're actually getting paid is based upon what it costs to, sustain the worker at a certain standard of living. What happens, though, of course, is that the worker is actually producing more value than what they actually receive back in a wage. So, to give an example of this, here I'll rely on another economist, Andrew Kleiman, who gives this example. So, again, imagine each hour of labor produces $60 in value. A worker receives $600 a week in wages. So, basically, just during the first 10 hours of the week, the laborer basically equals what they get paid back in their wage. So after working 10 hours, producing $60 in value per hour, they've already basically covered what her wage would be over the course of the week. But what happens after that? You don't just go home for the rest of the week. You work an additional 30 hours. And that additional 30 hours then obviously is then equal to about $1,800. And that is basically surplus value. That is unpaid labor, and it is the value which is then embodied in these products when they are sold. The capitalist basically gets to keep for themselves. It's actually a bit more of a complicated process than the one I just said. And there's a lot of things here that Marxists argue about. That's another important thing to keep in mind. Marxists argue about almost all of these things, in fact. So I'm giving you what I think is a fairly close interpretation to what Marx at least originally believed himself, and again relying on a few other people who also seem to stick pretty closely to what Marx thought. Um, but that is the basic idea. So this surplus value arises in the process of production. Obviously, over the course of a 40-hour week, the worker creates $2,400 in value, but you subtract $600 to cover her wage. So that gets subtracted out, but then you're still basically left with $1,800 of surplus value. Now, that surplus value is then embodied in the products, right? So there's $2,400 worth of value produced in these products. $1,800 is basically a surplus value. According to one interpretation at least, that that value is created during the production process, but realized in the process of sale. So it's not until these products are actually sold that the capitalist actually realizes that surplus value. But they would also hold that that value is created purely in the production process itself. It gets a little more complicated from there, so I'll just leave it at that. Now, again, as capital circulates, it takes on different forms. So capital itself goes through different forms. It can be money capital, it can be commodity capital, it can be production capital. At all different steps in this process, it is still uh, capital. So capital is not just money. Capital is what the worker is producing, what is then sold by the capitalist, and then finally it takes the form of money, you could say, and then is again sort of fed back into the system to expand the system even more. Capital also takes on different forms. Part of it is profit kept by the capitalist. Part of it becomes rent that the capitalist pays to a landlord, assuming that the capitalist doesn't sort of own the land. If it's a factory that it's paying, a rent to a landlord, somebody who owns that land. If the capitalist takes out loans from a bank, it's paying interest on its loans and things like that. Which also means, of course, that landlords and especially bankers have an interest in exploiting labor as well, right? The more surplus value that the capitalists can sort of wring out of the workers, squeeze out of the workers, it potentially means more value that the landlord and the banker can get into their hands as well. Part of this also is paid out in the form of taxes as well, but taxes would not really be considered, a component of capital. Now, based on this very simple idea, and it is simple, actually, when Marx analyzes the production of surplus value, he would say that you have to look at society as a whole. You have to look at the total amount of surplus value produced in a society and the total amount of capital which is invested in the society as well. And if even possible, beyond the level of society. How do you do something like that? Well, actually, most Marxist economists basically rely on official government sources as a means of doing so. Um, you can, go to something like, the Bureau of Economic Analysis and find data on this, how much, capital is being invested in the economy, how much, profits are being produced in the economy. For Marxists, profits basically equal surplus value. So, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, a government bureau, doesn't talk about surplus value. It talks about profit, and you could then assume that the total amount of surplus value is equal to the total amount of profit generated in the economy as a whole. Now, of course, this is another thing that people argue about. Some people would argue that you can't trust these government sources and things like that. That's another, debate that I'm going to mostly, uh, avoid for the most part. But again, using this sort of simple example illustrated above or in the previous slide, you can then calculate basically a rate of surplus value, sort of a ratio of how much surplus value is produced. So, and basically you just do that by, dividing surplus value by wages, which Marx also refers to as variable capital, V. Again, wages paid out to the worker is one capital expense basically that the capitalist has. The capital invests capital, which is used to purchase means of production and used to pay wages to workers. The means of production, Marx refers to as constant capital, or C. Variable capital is V. This is important for the kind of formulas which we're about to discuss here. Basically, the reason why he calls it variable capital is again the value which it adds to surplus value varies more, whereas the constant capital is more or less locked in at whatever the value is of the means of production. All right, so basically you divide 1,800 by 6, you get 3. So that means that the rate of surplus value is 3, indicating that for every dollar paid in wages, $3 of surplus value are created, which is kind of a lot. That's basically about 300%. Now, of course, what this means, though, of course, there's a sort of permanent incentive the capitalists have. They want to raise the rate of surplus value as much as they can. Workers, of course, want to increase their wages. So this basically sets capitalists and workers at odds against each other. They have sort of conflicting incentives here. And of course, if the capitalists can reduce the workers' wage, then they can increase their surplus value even more. Now, the rate of surplus value then becomes a major component in determining what the rate of profit is, which is a little bit different, but sort of derives from the rate of surplus value. The rate of profit is basically calculated using the rate of surplus value. But now you're looking at basically total capital invested, not just wages, but total capital invested in means of production as well. So again, and like I said, when discussing the rate of profit, you're basically looking at the entire economy. Now, let's say, for example, the cost of means of production is 300. So the rate of profit would be 1,800 divided by 900, right? Not 1,800 divided by 600, which would give you a rate of profit of 2. So, of course, obviously, when you factor into the other capital cost, the other capital invested into the production process, you're getting a lower rate of profit than basically just based upon the rate of surplus value. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, of course, how do you then raise the rate of surplus value? That's sort of the key then to raising the rate of profit. Capitalists don't care necessarily about the rate of surplus value. They might not even believe in the idea of surplus value, but they do, of course, believe in the idea of profit. And of course, the way you raise the rate of profit is basically also by raising the rate of surplus value, or maybe conversely by lowering the cost of means of production. But most of the time, the focus is going to be on surplus value. So one way in which you can do this is basically by reducing what it costs to maintain the worker. So again, if the value of the wage the worker gets paid is related to what it costs to maintain the worker, let's say food, for example, if you reduce the cost of food, then you can reduce their wages, basically, as did happen throughout the 19th century, without really suffering a fall in the living standard of the worker. Now, many people will say, well, what about starvation? There are many people that don't have enough things to eat and things like that. And of course, that's true. But again, you have to keep in mind that what Marx is talking about here, Marx is trying to analyze capitalism under more or less ideal circumstances, right? He's trying to take the circumstances already laid out by people like Adam Smith and Ricardo, and sort of showing like even if capitalism basically functioned the way it is supposed to, you would still have all these problems. But of course, the reality is much less than what the ideal circumstances, described by the advocates of capitalism are. So yes, of course, in many cases, workers are paid too low of a wage. But Marx is assuming that even if capitalists paid workers what it costs to maintain them at a certain level, you would still basically have surplus value. You would still basically have the exploitation of labor. So I'll run through this pretty quickly here. Again, you can look at these calculations. These are basically examples. Wages are cut by a certain amount, but if the cost of maintaining the workers falls by as much or even more, the worker is not going to suffer a decline in their standard of living. Another way in which you can increase the rate of surplus value is by increasing the productivity of the workers. So basically, using machines, obviously, and technology, if you can speed up the process by which a worker produces 4 hours of goods, let's say within 2 hours, then that's more goods that you can sell, and that can also then increase the amount of profit that the capitalist gets from the production process. Although there's a problem with that, which we'll get to in a moment. Another way in which this is done is to increase the intensity of labor, basically make the workers work at a faster pace, you know, producing more basically within the same amount of time. And then, of course, another example, especially more relevant now in modern times, is the outsourcing of production to lower wage countries. Again, China would be sort of the model example of this. Now you can really make a lot of profit because now you can pay workers an extremely low wage, far below what you would be able to pay them in the home country, and basically keep all that profit for yourself, which is basically what has happened basically since the 1980s. I would argue that the major conflict now between the United States and China is that the United States is beginning to lose the benefits that it used to gain from low wages in China. And now, not only that, but China is now beginning to compete with American industries, especially in the technology sectors of the economy, the high tech sectors of the economy. I think that actually plays a much bigger role in explaining contemporary conflicts between the United States and China than any of the given reasons that we hear from the United States government, which of course are mostly false. That China's this evil authoritarian country that's doing all these horrible things. Well, that may or may not be true, but is that a reason why the United States is taking a stronger stance against China now, or beginning to confront China now? In other words, does the United States consistently involve itself just because some people in some part of the world are being oppressed by a government? Obviously not. I mean, there are any number of examples that show that is obviously not true. The United States does not just automatically intervene whenever it sees people being, oppressed, like we're some kind of, superhero out there, trying to fight injustice. The United States could probably care less about the oppression of people in other parts of the world, so long as it does not, conflict with its own economic interest. The idea that China is becoming this aggressive military power also, I would argue, does not really make a whole lot of sense, especially since China basically enjoys peaceful relationships and very deep trade and economic and financial relationships with other countries, or even the idea that China is stealing all these jobs and doing all these horrible things and stealing intellectual property and things like that. Well, again, even if these things are true, these are hardly unique things. Almost every country has stolen intellectual property during its period of economic development, including the United States. So this is actually an idea that I'm very concerned with right now. It doesn't have that much bearing on the class, but I would argue that the major reason why you see the tensions between the United States and China increasing is because we are now getting to a point where the U.S. is getting a lot less economic benefit out of trade with China because wages in China are going up, and the productivity. China is also beginning to, again, use more high-tech methods of production, which also basically, reduce the profits that the United States is able to get out of China. That actually sort of leads me into the next slide here. Now we're sort of dealing with some of the, volume 3 stuff of, Capital. Again, as I've said, I've tried to, give you a very, condensed version of books that run for thousands of pages long. So obviously, inevitably there are going to be some things I miss or some things I don't spend enough time on. But I don't think I can do any better given the amount of time that I have right now to talk about these things. But now, when you get to sort of the more advanced stage of how a capitalist system operates and what happens, especially as the capitalist system develops more and more, is that Marx sees that there comes to be an increasing contradiction between profits and productivity. Basically, the more productive the economy gets, the more it tends to reduce the profit rate of the economy, which is problematic, obviously. Again, according to Kleiman, Marx held that as capitalist production develops, capitalists tend to adopt more productive, labor-saving technologies. That is, they turn increasingly to methods of production that replace workers with machines. Another economist, Guillermo Carcetti, refers to this as labor shedding technologies. Normally, we're familiar with the term labor saving technology, saving labor. Piketty insists on using the term labor shedding, meaning that the purpose of technology is to reduce the amount of workers in the production process. And again, the reason why this is done is one, because of the competitive nature of capitalism, right? Capitalists are constantly competing with other capitalists to gain market share, to outsell their competitors by lowering prices and things like that. And the way in which you do that is you increase productivity, like the example I gave before with the computer, right? The more you can increase your productivity, the more you can lower your price. That means that you can then basically outsell your competitors, at least until they also adopt the same methods, and then they tend to sort of cancel out that benefit that you get. But what also happens is then you have a tendency, again, for as productivity increases more and more, the prices of goods tend to go down more and more. But eventually, this starts to affect the profits that the capitalist is able to obtain. And again, this makes even more sense when you look at the economy as a whole. When you're looking at just individual companies, that may not be so clear. But when you're looking at the economy as a whole, Marx would argue there is at least a tendency. This is again another highly debated topic, but there's at least a tendency for the profit rate to fall. And the reason why this happens is because both this leads to another important concept known as the organic composition of capital, also known as the OCC, the ratio of constant capital to variable capital measured in terms of value. It reflects the proportion of investment in means of production, machinery, raw materials, etc., relative to investment in labor power, and is influenced by the technical composition of capital, but expressed in value terms. I mean, these are complicated terminology here. I appreciate people trying to keep up with all this, but basically, the technical composition of capital then refers to basically the ratio of machinery, basically, to labor power. The organic composition of capital sort of derives from that, but now you're not just looking at sort of the quantitative amount of machines versus workers, but the sort of dollar amount, if you will, of constant capital to variable capital. How much money is being spent on constant capital versus how much money is being spent on variable capital. There's a third concept in this too called the value composition of capital, but I'm trying to keep things as simple as I can. So basically, what happens? I'm sure this sounds very complicated, but if you think about it in simple terms, it kind of makes sense. So if workers are the source of profits in the capitalist economy, what happens if you reduce the amount of workers? You're going to reduce your um, profits. But again, Marx would argue because of the competitive pressures of the capitalist economy, that is something that most capitalists cannot resist, right? So they are compelled to adopt productivity increasing, enhancing technologies. But in the process of doing so, there's a tendency to replace more and more workers with machines. And as you do so, you produce less surplus value. As you produce less surplus value, you reduce your rate of profit. Now, again, going back to the US and China, this is another thing that you see playing out. Just simply saying that the wages of Chinese workers, while it's true, I think is a little too simplistic also. It's not just the case that workers, I'm sorry, that the wages of workers in China is increasing. China is also increasing its organic composition of capital. It's also increasing the ratio of constant capital. Again, it's using more high tech means of production, using more machines and technology in production, and reducing the amount of workers. There's actually fairly high unemployment rate in China, especially among young people, which also reduces the amount of profit produced by the Chinese economy, but also basically reduces the U.S.'s ability to sort of extract some of that profit for itself. This idea of sort of extracting or siphoning off some of the surplus value in China is another, somewhat complicated economic theory, but I think actually goes a long way to sort of explain why tensions between the United States and China are uh, increasing. The U.S. is getting less profit out of China, both on the one hand because of higher wages, but also because China itself is also increasing its organic composition. Okay, it's also, again, increasing its productivity as well, and that is actually having a negative impact on the amount of profit that the United States is able to basically get out of China. And there's evidence, in fact, that basically since around 2008, that the amount of surplus value that the U.S. is able to get out of China is significantly um, decreasing. Anyway, so the reduction in surplus labor and surplus value causes the rate of profit to fall over time. Again, this is best noticed when you look at the economy as a whole. As profits fall, capitalists reduce further investment. They're seeing that they're not making a lot of profit through investing more in production, so they cut back on it. Of course, as they cut back on it, you have even more layoffs. You slow things down. Uh, uh, this leads to basically an economic crisis, and if the crisis gets bad enough, to an economic depression as well. Now, every crisis superficially appears as a financial crisis, meaning that people just don't have enough money to sustain their business. But as economists like Kleiman and Michael Roberts and Carcetti and a few others have argued, is sort of the underlying cause of this is the falling rate of profit, including with the financial crash in 2008. So I'm beginning to wrap things up here, at least as far as talking about Marx goes. Here's a graph produced by the economist Michael Roberts, who shows basically, preceding every major economic recession since the 1950s, you see a massive fall in investment levels, which he again associates with a fall in the rate of profit. You can see in 2008 and 2009 there was a massive fall in investment levels preceding that crisis as well. Now, what has also happened is that basically in the 1970s, let me go over to the next chart here. In the 1970s, you started to notice a pretty significant decline in the rate of profit. So starting from the end of World War II, you could see that the rate of profit in the economy as a whole, again, this is looking at the economy as a whole, was pretty high, but the rate of profit started falling and falling and falling. That by the time you got to the 1970s, it had fallen pretty low. And basically, what did capitalists do to get the rate of profit going again? Here's another measurement here. Again, basically calculating the rate of profit in different ways: historical costs, current costs. A lot of this stuff is very technical, so you don't have to concern yourself too much with it. But there is a lot of empirical evidence that sort of backs up this idea. And again, to be fair, I mean, a lot of Marxist economists dispute this notion. But having read a lot of this literature, I've kind of become convinced that these people may be on the right track here. So what happened basically by the end of the 1970s? You have capitalists on the one hand, especially in the United States and in Western European countries, even more so in the United States, cracking down on workers, keeping their wages from going up, thus raising the rate of surplus value, which you've seen basically, decades of fairly stagnant wages here in the United States. You have, again, more and more outsourcing overseas. You also have, again, capitalizing on low wage labor and low productivity labor, meaning more workers relative to machines. I also have the increasing financialization of the economy. So a good analysis of what the U.S. economy has become since the 1980s is that basically the U.S. can't really get, the U.S. economy can't really get that many profits anymore out of manufacturing. And that is one of the major reasons why you've seen the relative decline of manufacturing in the United States. Manufacturing used to be obviously an important part of providing jobs to people here in this country, but that is no longer really the case. And to the extent that you still have manufacturing in this country, it's mostly become automated now. Again, it's mostly done through machines. So the argument is that because manufacturing is no longer really a profitable enterprise for most capitalists, they've simply taken most of their capital out of manufacturing and invested it in financial speculation, which then sort of gives you the run up to the economic crash of 2008, and even now, even since the economic crash of 2008, there's been no real revival of manufacturing in the economy. The economy is still basically based on financial speculation, as I showed a couple of classes ago. The so-called fire sector of the economy now makes up almost twice as much of the GDP as the manufacturing sector of the economy. This is the rate of profit on non-financial capital. So if you could sort of separate the rate of profit from the economy as a whole and only focus on the non-financial parts of the economy, you can see that the rate of profit is actually quite low. So finance is basically what is, or really maybe more so the fire sector of the economy, is what's really propping up the economy to a significant amount. The problem with that, though, is that finance doesn't create any new surplus value, right? The sort of Marxist argument against finance is that finance basically just redistributes already existing surplus value. It concentrates it in the financial sector, but it does so by basically sucking it out of the rest of the economy, which is obviously not good. It also leads to a very extremely debt burdened economy, which I've already demonstrated in previous classes is what you pretty much have in the US economy. So we're sitting on a giant debt bomb. We're not a very, you know, productive economy anymore. China, of course, is rapidly gaining on the U.S. and already sort of exceeding it in some areas of the economy, particularly in things like solar panels and things like that. Very very important technologies as well, 5G stuff like that, cellular technology. Um, and the U.S. is finding it harder and harder to compete. I think that's again a big part of the reason why you have these trade wars going on, as well as attempts to basically essentially sabotage the Chinese economy. Um, what else was I going to say about this? I feel like there's something else I want to say about it. Well, it's basically just not a sustainable thing, right? Obviously, you can't just keep piling on higher and higher amounts of debt in the economy, basically. So anyway, so to summarize capitalism from a Marxist point of view, a system defined by commodity production. Profits come from the unpaid labor performed by workers. There's a circulation of surplus value. Again, that's something I didn't really, touch on too much because it's complicated. But actually, areas of the economy with lower profit rates tend to sort of take surplus value from areas of the economy that have a higher profit rate. In the global economy, again, you can sort of see this where countries like the United States just have a fairly low rate of profit, actually kind of take surplus value from economies like China that have a higher profit rate. Oh, I remember what I want to say now. So besides the fire sector, what is really propping up the U.S. economy, of course, are its giant technology monopolies: Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, companies like that. According to one Marxist economist, Brian Greene, the 5 or 7 major technology companies, including Amazon, Netflix, I think is in there as well, basically make up like 60% of the profits of the U.S. economy. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. Many people would say, like, well, what do you talk about this falling rate of profit thing? When you look at profit data, it looks like things are doing well. Well, there's a difference between the rate of profit and profit margins, right? So the rate of profit in the economy, which looks at the total economy, could be going down, which basically just means the the percentage of profit which is produced in the economy every year. Um, Actual profits could still be going up, though eventually it will begin to fall if the profit rate keeps falling. But you also have a different way of calculating profit margins and the rate of profit. Um, it also, when you look at profit data as a whole, which paints a more optimistic picture, it doesn't, again, sort of look at, it sort of aggregates everything as a whole. So you can have a handful of companies, which again, about five or six or seven companies, account for about 60% of the profits in the economy. When you take those companies out, the rest of the profit data, again, according to Green here, is actually in negative territory. So the fire sector and a handful of technology companies may be propping up the economy, but the economy as a whole is actually very fragile. And actually, the rest of the economy is not doing, particularly well. When you take those economies out of the mix, the rest of the economy, it varies to some extent, but as a whole, is not doing particularly well. And again, this is also reflected by the increasing, debt burdens that corporations have. Of course, the still very, relatively low wages that most people are paid, obviously relative to the pay of CEOs and shareholders and things like that. Again, going back to these points here, so capitalism is also a very volatile system. It's prone to crises. Periods of prosperity are often followed by periods of depression. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The economy may seem like it's doing well, but this is just the sort of precipice of a massive economic fall. And I think that's what Marx wanted to communicate to people, right? Is that this is a system basically based on exploitation. It's a system that creates fantastic levels of inequality, as well as capital gets concentrated and centralized, as he says, into fewer and fewer hands. And it's also a very unstable system as well. And I think, rather than just sort of, waving the flag for socialism, which I guess is how most people think of him as, I think really what Marx is intending to do here is to sort of show you through sheer logical necessity why we should sort of move past the capitalist system. That the capitalist system as a whole is not a good, not a good system unless you're okay with those things, unless you're okay with an exploitative system, unless you're okay with, vast, inequalities of wealth and fundamentally a unstable, volatile system that is, prone to, basically a major crisis almost every 10 years or so. People sometimes, criticize Marx and Engels for making that prediction, but for the most part, it's kind of been true, and especially in recent years. I mean, we have basically since the 1970s seen a major economic recession every 10 years or so. People, and we'll talk about this more in future classes, but people, of course, have attempted ways to sort of, manage and regulate the most unstable aspects of the capitalist system. Try to pay people higher wages. Try to reduce the level of inequality, which is kind of what you did after World War II, basically up until the 1970s. But that system didn't work either. Eventually that broke down and probably didn't work as well as people would like you to believe that it did. So really, it's a system that can't be controlled. It can't be reformed. It can't be managed. You kind of have to make a break from it, basically. And the other things here too. I want to kind of move things on. I would also say, in closing of this section, that ultimately, even though there's a lot of talk about economics, ultimately this is a political theory, right? I mean, the only way you really get out of the capitalist system is through basically a revolution. For the workers to basically, as he says, seize control of the state, seize control of the government, basically, and then use the government to basically force the capitalists to give up control of the means of production, and then create socialism uh, that way. So ultimately, there is a strong, political component to this theory as well as things like we've already talked about, like what the Marxist view of the state is, what role the government plays basically in society, as well as the fact that again the political institutions of a society are largely determined by the economic structure of the society as well. Okay, so I hope you're all still with me now. I know that's very tough to digest for the most part. Again, try to keep in mind, like I've already said, summarizing some pretty, not only just a very long book, Capital Volume One, Volume Two, and Volume Three, but a fairly tough to read books as well. And if there's anything you feel like I didn't explain well enough and would like me to elaborate on, please let me know. I'd be happy to. But anyway, so with that in mind, I would argue that the American government was basically, founded to facilitate the development of capitalism in the United States. Capitalism was already basically developing. It would continue to develop more. When the Constitution was established, it basically, precedes the um, industrial revolution in the United States. England at this time was really the only country sort of going through the industrial revolution, and other countries would follow along afterwards. So at this point in time, the United States was basically an agrarian country. It's mostly an agricultural country for the most part, which I think is important to keep in mind as well. It also, right away raises the question. I mean, to what extent is the um, political framework of the Constitution still adequate for an industrialized economy today? Basically an economy that's much larger and that has, fundamentally changed the way in which wealth is produced in the society as well. Anyway, getting into the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution is somewhat more of a tricky thing that you might think. Many people would argue that there is basically more or less a straight line between the Declaration and the Constitution. In other words, that they're more or less basically founded on the same values and reflect basically the same principles. But many people would see there's actually kind of a contrast between the two. That in fact, the values of the Declaration basically conflict with, are basically in tension with the values of the Constitution. Let me move this over here now to some extent. But basically, yes, that the Declaration is basically the more, revolutionary, radical document, and that the Constitution is more of a conservative um, document. So, of course, most of the founders, even preceding the Constitution, were influenced by liberal thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu, so-called social contract theorists. The term liberal was not even sort of really used at this point in time. Liberal is sort of another term which sort of comes into the political lexicon after the French Revolution, but sort of retroactively, we now consider people like Locke and Montesquieu to be liberals. In Locke's second treatise of government, he defines natural rights as life, liberty, and property, which sounds very familiar to the famous passage here from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So why do you think basically they changed, and this is basically written by Jefferson, why do you think he changed property to the pursuit of happiness? That's something that people often, puzzle about. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So again, going back to last class, this is what Chesterton would call basically the creed of America: justice, equality, consent of the governed. Now, going back to the idea of life, liberty, and property, I mean, could it be, in fact, that Jefferson realized that you're going to have to get people who don't own any property to fight a revolution, to fight against the British government, and that telling people that they're waging a revolution in the name of property is not going to be very convincing to people. Some people argue it in terms of that. Some people would argue that, well, property is one way in which we pursue happiness, and maybe they're more or less interchangeable terms. I mean, many people, like I said, have sort of written on the relationship between the two, but it is interesting that it is so much change here. It does also, by the way, show you quite clearly the influence of Locke. We know, however, despite the lofty ideas of all men are created equal, not women, by the way, the reality of life in the new American Republic fell very short of these ideas. Now, of course, the Republic would not be created until some time later. but still sort of, more or less based upon this, concept, this sort of, this creed of America, as people would say. Women were considered citizens, but not allowed to vote. Very much like in ancient Athens, African Americans, slaves, and free men, people, not all African Americans, not all black people in the United States were slaves. Didn't matter. You were not allowed to vote, at least past a certain point. It's interesting enough. Many of the state governments at one time did allow free blacks, as they were sometimes called, to vote, but then took away those rights to vote at a later point. And it was sort of, vary state by state, but you could look that up if you're curious. Basically, Native Americans were not allowed to vote either. So the actual extension of voting was quite limited. Now, moving on from the Declaration to the Constitution, one influential book written on this was the book An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States by Charles A. Beard, written in 1913. And then Beard argues, this is, again, sort of coming out of the progressive era. We've talked about this a few times already. Sheldon Wolin places great emphasis on the progressive era. Randolph Bourne was a leading progressive intellectual. And sort of Beard sort of comes out of this intellectual background as well. For a while, this became kind of the most definitive interpretation of the Constitution. But then during the Cold War, it kind of fell out of favor, which is that sort of historical, timing is interesting as well. But basically what it is a kind of almost Marxist account of the founding of the Constitution. A little bit more simplified, maybe, than what Marx would argue. But Beard basically says that the Constitution was primarily motivated by the financial interests of the founders. That they basically want to make sure that, again, they had the greatest share in the government overall. And they want to basically keep out or minimize the role of people who either did not own any property at all, or owned very little. The founders were not, or the framers of the Constitution, because not all of the founders, not all of the revolutionary generation were in favor of the Constitution, by the way. So maybe the term framers is a more accurate term to use. The people who actually framed the Constitution, but not necessarily found the country, were extremely wealthy people. George Washington was the wealthiest man in America, largely through, owning slave plantations. He was a large landowner with many financial interests as well. He had so much money, he could kind of basically function like a bank. He basically would loan out money and receive interest on it. Alexander Hamilton, became the first Secretary of the Treasury, was a close personal aide to Washington, was also basically kind of like the mouthpiece and the point man for the financial speculators on Wall Street, which are already, sort of coming in to being on at this time. One of the major things that he did is he, engaged in one of the first major acts of financial speculation in the United States, which is that he helped his Wall Street buddies basically buy up all of the war bonds that were issued during the Revolutionary War. This is an interesting thing, and I think it's worth spending a moment or two on it. Basically, what had happened is that to finance the Revolution, the Continental Congress, as was called at the time, issued war bonds, right? So you buy a bond, you give the government money in exchange for, earning interest on that bond when the bond matures. What had happened though is that in the intervening time, I'm kind of glossing over here the Articles of Confederation, which is kind of our first constitution. Maybe I'll talk about it a little bit more next class. If I haven't already mentioned it already, this is kind of basically going to be like a two-part class. So I'll finish off talking about the Constitution next class. But basically, what had happened is that in the intervening time, from 1776, let's say, to about 1789. When the Constitution goes into effect, the war bonds had basically become worthless. The government didn't really have the ability to pay off the bonds. So many of the soldiers and farmers who bought these bonds had basically these sort of worthless pieces of paper. One of the things that was going to happen with the establishment of the new government under the Constitution was that they were going to make sure that all those bonds got paid off. And so what Hamilton did is he told his buddies on Wall Street, "Hey, buy up all these bonds now. You can buy them up very, very cheap because most people think these are worthless. And when the new government is formed, we're going to pay off all those bonds, plus interest, obviously." And that's what they did. So they bought up all these bonds very cheaply, accumulated large, stores of them. And then when the new government was proclaimed, these financial speculators made a big profit on it, basically through this kind of insider trading, basically, that goes on to this very day. The framers are also very much worried by things like Shays' Rebellion, which was sort of an uprising by farmers in the Northeast, basically against taxes and debt. These were people who fought in the revolution, who were under significant amount of debt, and were worried, basically, or were basically taking up arms against the government because of it. Um, so Henry Knox, who's another close aide to Washington, writes here, their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from confiscation of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. So here you have this notion of, not private ownership, but common ownership, or common property, maybe not even necessarily ownership, but just common use of things. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice and ought to be swept from off the face of the earth. And that's basically what happened. So, one of the major things that people talk about is that the Constitution is not a particularly democratic system of government, or the institutions that it lays out are not particularly democratic, which again is something we've been talking about, literally since the beginning of class. Contains several institutions, in fact, that quite blatantly reduce the power of a popular majority of people. The most prominent ones, of course, being the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court, all of which I'll sort of cover more next class. You also had something known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, which basically counted as slaves as three-fifths of a person in the South. Now, this compromise was ironed out basically because Southern plantation owners wanted all their slaves to be counted as part of the population. The reason for that is that the greater the population of the state, the more representatives that you would have in the House of Representatives, the more electoral votes you would also have, basically, by the way, in the Electoral College. So they wanted all their slaves to count, even though, of course, this is quite sinister because none of the slaves would actually have any political power themselves. If anything, they would use their political power to further reinforce the power of slavery. Obviously going against what was in the best interest of the slaves. The Northerners didn't want the slaves to count at all. And so eventually they ironed out this compromise where slaves would be counted as three-fifths of a person, literally counting them as less than a full human being. In many states, there were originally restrictions on the right to vote based on the amount of property that you have. And this was something that continued throughout in Europe throughout most of the 19th century. In the United States, it was resolved fairly early on, but still for about 30 or 40 years or so. You had these property restrictions on the right to vote. You couldn't even vote if you didn't own a certain amount of property. So Beard sort of lays out again what are sort of the economic interests here. So you have basically two property owning classes. In the South, you have plantation owners. In the North, you have basically merchants, people involved in commerce, financial interests, not much industry at this point. Again, this is sort of pre-industrial revolution in the United States. But you did have sort of two distinct property owning classes in the North and South who were at the very least unified in the idea that they want to make sure that they continue to have power, and the people who didn't already have great wealth and property basically didn't have any. So Beard writes here, the Southern planter was also as much concerned in maintaining order against slave revolts as the creditor in Massachusetts was concerned in putting down Shays' desperate debtors. And the possibilities of such servile insurrections were by no means remote. Every slave owner must have felt more secure in 1789 when he knew that the governor of his state could call in the strong arm of the federal administration in case a domestic disturbance got beyond the local police and militia. The North might make discriminatory commercial regulation, meaning tariffs and things like that. That was another issue that kind of set them apart. But they could be regarded as a sort of insurance against conflagrations that might bring ruin in their trade. It was obviously better to ship products under adverse legislation than to have no products to ship. Basically, what he's saying is that yes, the northern and southern ruling classes, basically, we'll call them that, had different interests in some extent, but of course they were, united in the greater interest that they had in making sure that they continued to have all the political power. And as a result, you have a very undemocratic constitution and system of government basically set up with that. And not everybody, like I said, worship the Constitution as this, divinely inspired document the way some people do. Like I said, many of the founders, like Jefferson, did not agree with the Constitution. You had a group known as the Anti-Federalists, which include people like Patrick Henry, who were very important in the American Revolution. He did not agree with it. Thomas Paine, one of the most important propagandists, I guess you could call him, of the American Revolution, did not agree with it as well, and kind of very much, fell out of favor. He was a foreigner from England, became very influential in the United States, kind of was, shunted aside by the, framers after the Revolution. You had early abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who referred to the Constitution as a covenant with death and agreement with hell, literally during a public ceremony where he burned a copy of the Constitution because of its support for slavery. I mean, imagine somebody doing something like that now. Imagine burning a copy of the Constitution. All right, so I've kind of set up an introduction to it. I think I'll get into the Constitution a little bit more next class. Give this very long preamble talking about capitalism, which I think is important. We've talked a little bit about tensions between the Declaration and the Constitution, and talked a little bit about the background of the Constitution. But I think next class I'll talk more about the Constitution itself, as well as the Federalist papers also. And also get into somewhat of the newspaper articles that I've set aside for next class, as well as FDR's economic bill of rights as well, since that pertains to things, potential constitutional amendments, which have obviously not been added to the Constitution, things that FDR talks about. But all right, I'm going to wrap things up here. So take care, everyone.